Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Cherie Best. You're listening to the Just Love Them podcast. Join me on a journey to understand and to find peace with those we love who have left their faith. Today, I am thrilled to introduce my guest. Well, I feel like all my guests are special. Every time I introduce a guest, I just feel like they're the most special guest I could have. And I feel that way again this time. Today, I have joining me Dr. Matt Draper, who is a philosopher, a poet, and a psychotherapist. He has published over 30 works, both academic and creative, and has shared over 70 professional presentations at conferences around the world. He's taught for 5 different institutions and earned tenure at 2 of them. Most importantly, he is a husband, a father, and a friend who has known great joy and great sorrow and endeavors to love all of those he encounters. My daughter, Madeline, was a student in Dr. Draper's class. She graduated from UVU with a degree in psychology, and Dr. Draper, who has requested that I call him Matt, is her favorite professor. In fact, Matt, I think when she was going through your classes, her upper level classes, I think it might have been during COVID because a lot of the lessons were online. And she would come to me and say, Mom, you have to listen to this class with me. It's so good. She just was she learned so much from you, and it really changed the course of her life. So thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here.
You have so much experience and so many things that you share with your students and that you've been through in your own life. Tell us a little bit about you.
When it comes to the principle of living love, let's just say I'm a fan. So, just 2 weeks ago, for example, I checked off another bucket list item. My father was a scriptorian, ancient scriptorian at Brigham Young University. And me seeming in the more secularist, more relativist side of things, it seemed unlikely that he and I would ever be able to create a work in common. And the theme of this particular conference at Berkeley University was on the finite nature of God. I approached my father and I said, Hey, Dad, you want to write a paper with me on the implications of the finitude of divinity and how that informs how we live love and grace with one another? And he hummed and hawed for a minute because he is an expert on what is called covenantal grace. Covenantal grace is the idea that it is only by engaging in certain promises with God do we get to know God's grace. However, there is also a far more prosaic understanding of grace, and that is the unconditional and radical loving kindness with which God approaches all of us, and therefore we can approach one another in that same way. So our argument went that if God is finite and if God is embodied, and if God is embodied as we are embodied, God feels feelings like we do, perhaps on an infinite scale. Just as we have hardened our hearts and our bowels have been moved with mercy, right? Sympathy tears, compassionate tears, so too does God. And if God has a body, therefore the bodies become very important. And so it seems important to care for the bodies of others, making sure others are safe and sheltered and fed. And therefore, grace can be a very practical manifestation for those who believe in a finite deity, not just an abstract sending thoughts and prayers ideology, but instead a very concrete. Do you have a meal for Wednesday?
Wow.
One of the principles that I teach is fourth dimensional thinking. This is a Draperism. Madeline may have told you about it. So, fourth dimensional thinking is a way of thinking that I developed informed by Eastern Christianity, Buddhist thinking, the 4 stages of feminist thinking. And it just really dawned on me that if we are living love with one another, that exists in a particular context in a particular way. So the 4 dimensions of thought go like this, basically. The first dimension of thought is categorical. Okay, categorical means a thing is what it is, or a person is who they are based on the categories of our culture that we ascribe descriptively to that particular person. So, for example, I encounter Cherie Best. I've noticed that you use she, her pronouns in referring to yourself. Therefore, you fit these definitional categories of female in our particular culture. Here I am, bearded, deeper voice, right? I'm probably at least a foot taller than you. So I meet all of these definitional criteria for man. So therefore, category man, category woman, we check those boxes. Likewise, in the mental health field, is somebody suffering from major depressive disorder, recurrent severe? Well, there's a list of criteria. And if the patient meets those criteria sufficient, then they fit in the category of someone suffering from major depressive disorder, recurrent severe.
Makes
Now,
sense.
second dimensional thinking is an extension of the first dimension. Second dimensional thinking is where we take one category, and then by defining that category, we are simultaneously defining its opposite. So, for example, let's pretend that we build on that first dimension about men and women. Then we would say, okay, if men are hairy, women must be less hairy. If men are taller, women must be shorter, right? Likewise, we do this morally. If taking life is bad, then preserving life is good, right? And this is always bad and this is always good. So by defining one, we are unconsciously and often not even deliberately defining the other in polar opposite terms. So oppositional thinking. So
Mhm.
think of this as antithetical reasoning. Third dimensional thinking relies on the observation that the categories of the first and second dimension are arbitrary. There are times and places and cultures where the categories that we so rely on in the first dimension and the second dimension appear to be just arbitrary. Okay. For example, there are times and places where men and women were not considered opposite, right? And in fact, are just that there's more genders besides. And women can move in and out of categories as can men, depending on time, place, and culture. So, therefore, also definitions of good and evil are also relative and not necessarily oppositional. Like one of the things I tease my students about is I tell them a story of a man who has like he starts seeing things out in the desert. He was once wealthy, but out of paranoia, he leaves the great city and he starts seeing things as an extension of this paranoia. And he feels commanded to bring the family genealogy back with him out into the wilderness and sends his sons in to get it. Basically culminates in one of the sons killing a helpless drunk warlord as he lies in the gutter, stealing his armor, going in, convincing the slaves to give them the genealogy, and leaving. Right? When you look at that same story, the story of Nephi taking the brass plates from Laban for your audience members who are Latter day Saints, then from one point of view, it's a tale of insanity and homicide. From another point of view, it is a tale of desperation, of faith, of faithfulness, right?
Right.
And so all of this seems very relative. People make up words. Words accomplish certain meanings, ideas accomplish certain things. So therefore, it's all relative, right? Well, the problem with the first dimension, second dimension, is this false certainty. We can transcend categories. So, for example, I've worked a lot in addiction. We've placed somebody in the category of addict, and we have placed them in a box that there is no redemption from. Likewise, with the second dimension, things that are good in one context are actually bad in another context, right? What's the difference between medicine and poison? Dose, right?
Yes.
Context, right? So you get this false certainty with the first and second dimension of thought. Whereas with the third dimension of thought, it's another form of certainty. To just blow off all concerns as just relative is to do them a disservice. Because if our hearts are aching or rent in twain with deep moral concern over this particular issue on this particular context, right now to say, oh, it's all just relative, belies the truthfulness in that particular context in that particular way. So with this fourth dimension of thought, let's use the example of love. One day, my youngest son hit a high water mark. One of his rites of passages as a Draper. He was going to dungeon master his first Dungeons and Dragons game. I was bursting with pride. He was 14 at the time. And so he comes and sits down next to me, and I'm sitting in my big lazy boy, and I'm surrounded with monitors. And he comes and sits down and says, Dad, would you help me design a good adventure for my friends? And I said, of course. And so he sat down, and we're working on mapping out the dungeon, where the monsters are, and where the traps are, and everything. And after a few minutes of us working together, I notice he grows quiet. And as I look over at him, he's tearful. And I look at where his gaze is going, and it's going over to my left to one of the monitors on the side of me. And on that monitor is a picture of me and one of his older sisters on the top of Mount Tippinokas. And it slides by me and the same sister on the top of Mount Neba. The slide, me and the same sister sighting in rifles out in the Great West Desert. Me and the same sister engaging in this or that outdoors adventure. And choking up, he looks at me and says, Dad, you love her best, don't you? And
Oh,
I look at the picture and I look at him and said, Of course I love her best. Yeah, you see where I'm going with
I
this, right?
do.
And so he chokes up and I said, Would you please just wait a moment, son? And a few minutes later, then pictures scroll by. He and I cooking in the kitchen. He and I teaching the Boy Scouts how to throw knives. He and I playing Dungeons and Dragons with his friends when I was the dungeon master. And I said, do you see now in this context, you are my favorite? Although I love both of you children infinitely in quantity, context of the manifestation of our love differs. Every time I want to go on an adventure up some mountain or out into some great desert, I invite all of you children. Your sister is the first one to say yes and to strap on her boots. You say, no, Dad, I don't want to go out. And I say, you don't have to. But then when I say, okay, it's time to fix the big family dinner, you're the one that says, great. And you grab your ladle. I love you both infinitely in quantity, but the manifestation of our love varies in context. So when we're thinking fourth dimensionally, we get to think of what is the context of a thing. In what context? I'm 6.5 feet tall. I weigh 340 pounds. Obsequiously masculine is the way a former professor once characterized me. But in what ways am I simultaneously feminine? In what ways am I emotionally self aware? Like in this home, I'm the kisser of boo boos. And my wife is the mechanic. So, this fourth dimensional thinking allows us to transcend the false certainty of the first and second dimension and the radical certainty of the third, that everything is just relative. But unfortunately, what that leaves us with is uncertainty. I do not know as a father always the best way to love my children. I can embrace the context and navigate the context, and it is a relational process, and I do it with them. My father's concern was that this fourth dimensional way of thinking is entirely too relative when many covenants are written, especially in the second dimensional frame. So,
Yes.
therefore, by adding in context, it seems like a slippery slope. For example, well before this presentation, it's been a couple of years ago, he was asking me about the four dimensions of thought. And he says, okay, how about fourth dimensional thinking when it comes to adultery, which is an absolute rotten, worst evil that he could field in this particular conversation? And I said, okay, let me tell you two different stories. Story one, a friend of mine comes to me. His wife is thinking of filing for divorce because she's caught him cheating again. And talking to me about how it is that he is navigating his adulterous relationships and that he derives great arousal and satisfaction by getting away with it. That it's his cheating on her and him getting away with it is part of the thrill of fornication, of the adultery, right? And his intentionality to keep doing it. And then me angrily confronting him because I'm very fond of his wife. She's a dear friend. And our bloody row after that, right? Well, there's another friend of mine. I didn't find out about this until he was neck deep in trouble. His wife is very abusive, physically, emotionally, and he is very gentle. Their bedroom has been dead for years, and no negotiation or even bringing it up. Anytime he does something that is soft or gentle or vulnerable, he is mocked and shamed for it by her. One day, for example, he observed that she was very jealous if any woman in their church or any woman at work paid him any attention at all, even platonically. And she made it very clear that although she despised and was disgusted by him, no one was allowed to have sex with him either. He found himself growing closer and closer to a colleague at work. Those conversations at work started to transcend work, and they went from platonic to intimate to sexual. And he found himself in the midst of affair. He dared not leave his wife. She had access to far more financial resources and had threatened him that if she left, she'd take the kids with her. Secrets, as you know, they don't stay secret. And so she found out and fulfilled every measure of her threats. And so I say, Dad, both of these adulteries are problematic. That's where you and I are on the same page. There's a reason why we use the word adultery to describe it. At the same time, though, the context of the adultery is very different, right? Not that it gives moral permission to either of these fine men. Well, I don't know, the first one's terribly fine. He and I are still on the outs. But that in the first case with this first man, he was deliberately using his wife's trust and violating his wife's trust for his own gratification, right? That seems like a different kind of adultery than another one. Somebody devoid of any intimate connection with anybody, slowly fostering a relationship with somebody who genuinely cares. And she very much nurtured him through the horrors of his divorce, right? And so, yes, adultery is a problem, but you see how that problem manifests differently in context.
Yeah.
Okay. And so for dad just now, I'm not saying my dad is fully on board with fourth dimensional thinking. But when I proposed that paper, he initially said, I can't write this paper with you for this Berkeley conference because it's too covenantal grace doesn't apply. And so I said, Dad, I am a sinner. I am at best a terrestrial soul, and I feel the love of Christ. I feel it every time I encounter those who are other than I. I have felt it in the deepest, dankest corners of prison. I have felt it trying to save somebody's life who's overdosing on heroin. I have felt it as I've held my own children in my arms. And if me, a sinner, can feel it, then this grace is not merely covenantal. I do not wish to minimize the importance of covenantal grace. There's this very lived grace. How did God, in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, for example, in the New Testament, did he only do miracles for the saints? No. Did
No.
he only do miracles to save right now and eternally? No. Crying out loud, the parable of water into wine was to save the bride and groom from shame in their society. It had nothing to do with a grand cause other than the cultural expectations at that particular time for that particular couple as an act of love manifested as a miracle.
Yes.
So, therefore, maybe, yes, covenantal grace is important. I don't understand that. That's what my father is so good at. He understands the Hebrew and the Greek and how it manifested with modern scripture. What I understand is when a child has a skinned knee, they don't need to be baptized to get a band-aid.
I like that. Wow. Talk to me about how this fourth dimensional thinking can transfer into a home environment. Say we have parents who prescribe to, strong religious beliefs, and we maybe have a child who doesn't. Maybe they're even a young teenager, and there's differences of opinion, there's conflict as a result of that. There's desired autonomy on the part of the child and desired compliance on the part of the parent. How does this fourth dimensional thinking, can you give me an example or some understanding about how my listeners would navigate something like that or understand maybe on a different level that kind of a situation?
Okay. Oh, I've got a lot to say about this. Now let's see if I can organize all the bees of thoughts buzzing in my head into something resembling a train of thought. I'm going to evoke a couple of constructs. One is eternal life. The other is sealing covenant. Both of these constructs are extremely important. If we are suffering conflict in a family, it means we might have lost sight of some things. For example, a few years ago, we were doing group family therapy. Okay, this was at an addictions clinic in Linden. Group family therapy is where, for those listeners who don't know, it's where the family members of an identified patient, usually suffering from addiction plus mental illness, the identified patient is not in the room, but family members across multiple families, across multiple patients are. And so it's usually quite a large group, anywhere from, say, 8 to 15 people. And one of the things, because we're in Utah County, that many of these family members express concern about is that the person suffering from addiction and mental illness is preventing or violating the eternal family, that we won't be together forever as a family because of the behavior of the person suffering from addiction. And they talk about all of their sometimes desperate bordering on abusive ends that they have engaged in to try to control the addict's behavior. And it seems like the more they try to control them, the more and more rebellious the addict becomes.
I can
And so
attest to
therefore,
this from personal experience.
sounds familiar, does it?
Does a little too much, yeah.
So here's something that I wondered out loud. As your family love one another enough that the boundaries of heaven and the gates of hell cannot keep you apart. You think that eternal family means conformity to cultural expectation. That is not what eternality is about. The devastating fact for those of us that have known great love and great loss is eternity is not length, it is depth. And if our love is eternal, it is the deepest possible feeling. My children will not go to any corner of any part of this universe that is too dark, I will not follow. But I will not demand that they follow me back. I will show them the way. I will point to the light, but I cannot move their feet for them. But they will never be free of the love of their Father. So, fourth dimensionally, none of my children are active Latter day Saints. At the same time, though, all of them know that push comes to shove, whether emergency or not, they can come to dad, and I will be there.
And as you're saying this, I'm envisioning a God who would say the exact same thing.
Yes. Imagine a Christ reaching up constantly, who embraces us with grace, who embraces us with that radical love, and is always already there, transcending reciprocity. You are loved in eternal ways that you cannot possibly imagine. And the only way is to stay always at the edge of those desperately touching fingers. Let me bring you into the embrace of my love. Nope, not ready yet, Jesus. Right? I'm always here. I'll always love you. But it is your life that will indicate how close and how far we are. I am always here, right? At least the Christ that I envision, the Christ that I read about. So, how does fourth dimensional thinking apply? Well, my daughters. One of them is biological, one of them is adopted. And the one that we adopted, we first met when she was 8 years of age. She was a neighborhood child. Like, mom was not terribly invested in her welfare, so she spent a lot of time at everybody else's house. And from a young age, she's 24 now, and from a young age, was calling my wife and I mom and dad. When she was finally removed from the home of her family because of abuse and neglect, she chose to live with us. Because of her background, lack of education, lack of nurturing at the home, then she was a little different than the other girls. Right? Didn't learn about certain basic activities about being a girl and being a teenager until a little bit later. And I'll never forget a moment. They were 12. And this is one of my failures as a dad moment. Just spoiler alert. There's a little girl who lives around the corner from us, and she's like the queen bee of the neighborhood. And because, they're going through puberty together, and this girl who we had not yet adopted didn't know that we would eventually adopt was behaving in ways that the queen bee didn't appreciate, that she created a shunning of this neighborhood girl. And of course, the queen bee is the one that's always, bearing her testimony first in young women's and is always the shining star and all the church stuff. And so therefore, when she did the shunning, that shunning applied to the neighborhood, the school, as well as church. My daughter was approached by Queen Bee. My biological daughter was approached by Queen Bee. Queen Bee said, look, you're either going to be my friend or her friend. And if you go with her, I'm not going to be your friend anymore. And my biological daughter chose my future adopted daughter. And sure enough, all the other girls at school, in the neighborhood, and at church closed ranks. So she came home, and this is where I dropped the ball as a dad. It was that same day. And she comes to me, and she is upset. And I have always been the dryer of tears and the kisser of boo-boos in this house. And she and her mother were on the outs at this point. My wife is very practical. There's a solution to every problem. You go to my wife with tears, she'll give you a solution, right? Whereas for me, I'm more willing to sit in the mud. Our tears mixed with the dust of the earth creates the mud that we all sit in forms of suffering. So my daughter comes in and she's really upset, and I embrace her, and I got mad, not at my daughter, right? But she's telling me about this, and they said this, and now they won't even look at me, and they ride their bikes away from me. And well, you don't need those pretty people anyway. Just I went off for a couple of seconds. And it was interesting. She looked up at me, and it's like the tears just got sucked right back in the corners of her eyes. And she just went like, go it, and disengaged from me and walked away. I said all the wrong things, right? Because the right thing would be to get in the mud, to validate the suffering, to appreciate, and then maybe eventually suggest some solutions or some possibilities. Now, I screwed up, man. I attacked the very people she's heartbroken over, these girls who rejected her. She's
Yeah.
craving them, and then I get angry and say, well, you should be rejecting them too. It doesn't make sense when you're brokenhearted.
Yeah.
So the beautiful part of it is I come walking downstairs a little while later, kind of realizing that I'd screwed up. My beloved is sitting against the washing machine in the room behind me, and who is collapsed on her chest, but my biological daughter sobbing, and my wife was just holding her, stroking her hair, saying, I am so sorry. That is just awful. I know how much those girls mean to you. And I just breaks my heart they're treating, saying all the right things. And so thank goodness. And so their relationship started to build from there again. But it's one of those where does fourth dimensional come in? Well, let's fast forward a few years. Young women's girls camp. At Young Women's Girls Camp, my wife was camp director. It's a, for those of you who don't know, that is a very, very intense calling. Super intense. Okay. It takes a village, by golly. It takes a whole team. So during the testimony meeting, I was the man. I think they call them like the priesthood or something like that. They need a biological male there who's in relatively good standing. And the girls were sharing their testimonies together and hugging each other and loving each other. And it was really beautiful to watch. Well, both of my daughters are their own people. They march to the beat of their own. They don't march to the beat of the same drum, even. Both of their drums are different, right? And then it broke my heart because about a month later, again, girls hugging, loving each other. They'll be sisters forever. Testimony meeting at girls' camp next to a campfire. Fast forward a month later. And out of desperation, one of the Sunday school teachers for the teenagers reached out to me to teach. And so I show up to teach. And interestingly enough, the topic was on charity, it was on love. And it's one of my favorite topics. And so I'm outlining things with chalk on the board. And I turn around and my biological daughter's running a little bit late. And so she comes in and she sits down next to the two girls who are love and honor the most. And those girls look at each other, look at her, look at each other, look at her, stand up, and then walk to the back of the room and sit on it. Just a clear shunning.
Oh, wow.
My daughter looks shocked and appalled and is sitting there just stunned and starts to softly cry. I actually had a rare moment of restraint and I didn't make the same mistake the second time. But about halfway through the lesson, I just observed that behavior and asked about it. And well, because my daughter is strange, she is not of the gospel, because the gospel, you look a certain way, you act a certain way. And because it's not of the gospel, then they didn't want to be around her. And I'm like, but you guys were just hugging on each other a month ago. And they're like, oh, what happens at girls' camp stays at girls' camp. Okay. So if I go to my 15-year-old daughters and I say, okay, time for church, why would they want to go? And
Yeah.
so I share this story to adults and they say, well, she should know that's not the church. No, the church is the people. Doctrine is not the people. Doctrine is doctrine. The church is the people, right? It's the organization, it's the structure, all made, oh my gosh, you're right, people. So therefore, if I'm coming to my daughters and I say, okay, it's time to go to church, it's very understandable that they would go, no. And it's very important for me to say, got you. You will always be invited. There was always a warm spot in the bench next to me. So it's asking a lot of a teenager or a young adult to understand that the people around them can be beautiful and amazing and awful. It's a really big ask for us to look at ourselves and say, oh my gosh, I can be beautiful and amazing and awful. Like one of the things, Sheree, this may not be true for you, but I know it's true for me. I am the villain in some people's stories. In fact, ironically enough, while trying not to be the villain,
Yeah.
how many people have I hurt trying to help?
Oh, my goodness. I know exactly what you're talking about. I can think of so many stories in my own life where, as a mother of teenagers, I was trying to be the one that saved them, that helped them, and ended up totally being the villain instead in their eyes. I
Get
know
it?
exactly what you mean.
If you get it. And so I can, of course, coercion is not the way. For those that believe in the premortal existence, the plan of Satan, the plan of Christ, Satan's plan was coercive. Christ's plan was invitational. So therefore, if we wish to live Christ, then we model Christ and we invite, we do not coerce. So back to the point. Eternal life, sealing covenant. If the sealing covenant is real, then you and I, three, having just met, today's the first time we've seen each other's faces, right? You and I are sealed. And that's kind of startling for people. But if you think about it, if you and I go back far enough, if we have one of those fancy apps where you can hit the button, it'll tell us, we're six cousins twice removed. That means if we go back six generations, we shared the same grandparent. And if they're sealed, if they're sealed to their kids, if their kids are sealed to their kids and their kids, we are all part of the same family, right? We are sealed together. The only way somebody can violate the sealing covenant is by absolutely refusing eternally to do so. And because eternity is a very long time, I tend to have a great deal of patience with my kids. If the sealing covenant is real and if life is eternal, there's no hurry. Okay.
Love
I
that
don't have to
perspective.
force them or coerce them right now. I get to love them and invite them. Right? If they say, well, Dad, how do you tolerate hypocritical Mormons? My answer is, I count my own hypocrisy. You know what I mean? Like I am not in any way flawless. And if kids, if I have ever misled you to think that old dad, and you should know you've lived with me your whole life, right? If you know that I'm who I am, then you know I'm deeply flawed. So therefore, why should I pick on other people's flaws when I've got plenty of my own? To judge judgmental people is to be, you're right, judgmental.
Yep.
Right? And so, but it takes a while. When we're young and we're sensitive, it sucks being judged. It sucks being ostracized. And then after a while, you get kind of comfortable living in your own skin. And then later, when it clicks, when it really clicks, you begin to love other people and you don't care about their opinions. You don't care what their opinion of you is. You know, they can judge you, they can like you, they can dislike you, and all of that is wonderful and great because you are there to care for them in whatever way you can, authentic to the context. Just like with Jareth, my youngest, my daughter, right? He's watching the pictures go by. We love one another in the context of our unique and shared being. God loves Cherie in ways that must be different than how he loves me. You and I have similar crosses that we have borne, but not all of them are the same. And so, therefore, God is loving Cherie in the context of Cherie's being and loving Matt in the context of Matt's being. The love is both infinite for, right? And at the same time unique.
Yes.
That's what we can bring to our children. I invite my kids, I don't coerce. I try to make sure that this is a house where they feel that they are always loved. At the same time, though, some people say, well, what about standards? Okay, good point. I have standards. Standards you have for other people is just premeditated resentment. I'm going to say that again. When you have standards for other people, it's premeditated resentment. So our standards are very basic. Don't bring drugs into my house. Don't commit crimes and implicate us in anybody in this home. You do not endanger this health, safety, and welfare of the people in this house. I will happily pack your stuff and put it out on the front porch if you do that. Okay. Besides that, it's negotiable. So I have taught my children correct principles. They will govern themselves. We see the scripture in the Old Testament, and we see it even up into the modern day times. Right? Joseph Smith even commented on the same thing. So therefore, as my children govern themselves, one of the things that is powerful about an eternal life is logical consequences. You know what I mean? Like if one of my kids kind of sneaking out on one of their partners and their partner finds out, the logical consequence is a violation of trust, right? One of my
Absolutely.
kids decides they're going to start tumbling through cannabis and then they start getting a little weird and paranoid and sick. Hey, logical consequences. Don't bring that in. Don't bring any drugs into my house. Thank you very much. But here, you kids, you get the logical consequences, right? And so there's a lot of things that after I've taught them the correct principles, that now life will teach them. And life is a much crueler teacher than I am.
I love that. These are the kinds of things that I wish that I could have been the young parent listening to years and years ago because I spent a lot of time coercing and I did it out of fear because I was afraid that my children weren't going to do this. I was afraid they all, all the things we've talked about, the eternal consequences. I had fear about all of that. And I feel like there are so many people out there who have the same thing and they coerce out of fear when really what you have described, this invitational love, this long-sighted vision of the eternities of how we have all this time and how we're just going to keep inviting, and that people need to have this ability to make their own choices and that we will always be there for them. I loved what you said about there's a warm spot on the bench for you waiting whenever you're ready, and that you would reach through all eternity to find that child in the darkest corner. I think that resonates especially with parents. Like, we are never going to let our children go. We are never going to stop loving them. We are never going to stop reaching out for them. We love them so deeply. They have no idea how loved they really are. To get rid of the fear, which is what leads to the coercion, in my opinion, and to have this invitational attitude, it changes everything about the way you think, about the way you execute, about the way you can love them, and how they can then be free to receive whatever it is they're willing and open and ready to receive. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
There's an extension of this, Cherie, and that is the nice and kind dilemma. So nice is where you care about people's feelings. Kind is when you are concerned about their welfare. I prefer to be both nice and kind, but if I have to choose one, I'm going to be kind. There are children that because they violated the basic tenets of our house, and there's very few rules, right? Don't sweat the small stuff. It's all small stuff. You get to a certain age where you're like, oh my gosh, all these are details, and details don't matter. But there are a few big things that do. You bring drugs into my house. You are some way threatening the welfare of my sweetheart, my other children. The logical consequence is when you do that with people, they then need to distance themselves from you. So your stuff is out on the front lawn. We love you. You are welcome here for Sunday dinner. If you are unsafe at Sunday dinner, you will not be welcome at Sunday dinner for a period of time. I will wait a while. One of the tragedies, and you may have experienced this, that one of the most loving things you can say sometimes is goodbye. And so, one of the things, again, if life is eternal, any goodbye is just a goodbye for now. But we'll try this. We'll try this as an experiment. You're always welcome at Sunday. Oh, great. Sunday dinner went well. Hey, we're going to a movie on Wednesday. You want to join us? That we get to model reconciliation as much as we do firm boundary holding.
I love that. You've given us so much to think about today, Matt. Thank you so much for taking your valuable time and sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. It's been an honor to figuratively sit at your feet and learn from you. Thanks for being here.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And for my listeners, thank you for being here. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Give us a rating and a review. But most of all, you've probably thought of someone else who is struggling with someone you love that you're learning how to love better. Please share this podcast episode with them so that they can gain this help and the solitude and the understanding and the love to love their people better. Just like I wish I would have had that so many years ago. There's no need for them to wait like I did all these years. You can share this episode with them now, and they can learn and benefit and love their people. Please join me again next time for another episode of Just Love Them.